All right, things changed dramatically in 1941 in a couple different ways. Two big ones.
Before we move on, were like people in those countries, like as Germany invaded, like obviously a lot of them had fascist movements and stuff. Were there people who were like, as Germany invaded, they were like, okay, I'm gonna like, other than like just like people who are like, oh, I can become the new French fascist.
There was support.
But, like,
yeah, I mean there were French fascists who weren't
like joining up in the army and stuff.
Well, they were
right?
conflicted because they didn't want France to lose. They were happy that France was now a fascist country, but they were not happy to have lost.
So bittersweet.
Yeah, exactly. Listen.
So, did Hitler learn from the last kind of frequent failed attempts to conquer Russia, or like try anything different, or did he just kind of think that like, well, he conquered the rest of the, basically like he conquered the rest of Europe, he's gonna be fine.
Hitler knew by June of 1941 that his blitzkrieg tactics were fantastically successful. And he was pretty sure the Russians wouldn't know how to handle it any better than the Poles or the French did.
Were the like French like be prepared? Like, did they have communication with the Soviet Union at all? Like, be
Not
prepared for the
much.
blitzkrieg?
Yeah, not much. Essentially, when the Germans and the Russians signed the Nazi-Soviet pact, the French and the British cut the Soviets off. They're like, we're not talking to you. And so there wasn't any conversation after the French had sort of figured out what blitzkrieg was the hard way. There was not any. So Germany invades the USSR on June 21st, 1941, longest day of the year. They did that on purpose because it's the most daylight. And the Russians were totally unprepared. And the reason for that was that, as I mentioned earlier, Stalin had purged his officer corps in the late 30s. He had arrested 36,000 army officers and either executed them or sent them to concentration camps, gulags. And so...
Was that like in like paranoia or in worry of a military?
That's an excellent question. Basically, the Soviets had not fully purged the old Russian military, so this was partly just a purge to get rid of the old officers who had been there before the Russian Revolution, because you can't trust them, they're not dyed-in-the-wool Soviets, communists, and part of it was paranoia. And part of it was a way of making sure that the military didn't challenge Stalin's authority. It's like, I'm going to break you right now before you cause a problem. So the Russian military was in somewhat disarray. Lots of officers had been promoted way faster than they should have been, and they didn't have as much experience as they should have to be majors or colonels or generals. And they were totally, and there had been so much chaos in the late 1930s, and the Soviet army had really not recovered yet, and so they were not ready for this. And the long story short is that the Germans would have a streak of the summer of 1941 and then the summer of 1942 again. The Germans would push literally thousands of miles into the Soviet Union. I mean, they would be, by the summer of 42, they're besieging Leningrad, they're outside the gates of Moscow, they're over at Stalingrad, they're pushing down into the Caucasus. They are pushing, I mean, this distance here in the United States would be like starting in, say, California and winding up in Kansas. I mean, we're talking serious conquest here. Any questions about that? The other thing that happens in 41 on the date that shall live in infamy, according to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and attacks the U.S. Navy there, and the U.S. would declare war on Japan. And then on December 12th, Hitler would declare war on the United States, honoring that treaty with Japan. And I'll talk much more about that and the Pacific Theater next time, but any questions? So 1941 brings two new major powers into the war. The USSR and the United States are now fighting in the war, and we're not before. in Europe, the turning point in the war is the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad is over here. This is actually, this map is wildly inaccurate, and it just drives me nuts every time I teach this. It says Stalingrad is right here. Stalingrad today is called Volgograd because it's on the Volga River, which is over here. So you can't really see it, but on the map, Stalingrad is here. The actual Volga River is here, so Stalingrad's, they have a couple hundred miles in the wrong direction. So,
That's crazy wrong. Like,
yeah, it is.
if it's on that river, that's
Yes.
wildly inaccurate.
Yes, it is. Yes.
How do you make a map? Like, did they just want to be able to fit in the dates so without making it too long?
You'd think they could just put the little star over here rather than over
And
here.
it can all be on the other side.
But,
Like they did with Leningrad.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So, when the by 19 summer 41, the Germans are pushing way into Russia. The Russian army is basically a speed bump. It just the Germans take over 2 million prisoners. The Russians are just surrendering like crazy, and incidentally, it does not go well for them. The Germans basically put them in POW camps and never feed them, and they all starve to death. So, because they're subhuman, they're the wrong race, right? But the Russians basically
You forget about all that.
decided that the only way they're going to win the war is, the first thing they did is as soon as the Germans invade, they take all the industrial production from Moscow, Petrograd, Ekaterinburg, etc., and they move it over to the Ural Mountains, which is off the map, way out of the way of the Germans. So they have all their industrial production. Even though the Germans are threatening all these industrial cities, they've moved all the factories and all the machinery way over to the
Are they
Ural
like
Mountains.
moving people too? Like, are they taking factory workers and stuff?
Sometimes. I mean, some skilled workers, yes, others no.
Because they can just
'Cause
replace
they're-
them with
yeah.
whoever's there.
And so then the Russians start a massive draft in 1941-42. They start drafting peasants. They set up training camps. They start doing military training. And they spend all of 1942 building an entirely new army back by the Ural Mountains, while the old army is getting chewed up by the Germans in the West. Does that make sense? By Stalingrad, they have realized they are ready to launch their new army at the Germans. They have 8 divisions, which is a massive number of soldiers, that they bring up around Stalingrad. And essentially, Stalingrad is like right here. They bring up 4 divisions north of Stalingrad and 4 divisions south of Stalingrad. But the Germans don't know they're there. Okay? So in August of 1942, the Germans get to Stalingrad, and Stalingrad is on both sides of the river, and they very quickly take the side on the east side of the river, or the west side of the river. They take that very quickly. And they think, oh, well, this is no problem. Just, like 25% of the cities on the east side of the river will take that, no problem. They think this is going to be a cakewalk. But what they don't know is that the Russians have told the soldiers in Stalingrad, you are to sacrifice yourselves. Do not give up an inch. Fight for every single inch of territory in Stalingrad. And so the Germans get across the river into eastern Stalingrad, and they suddenly find the Russians are literally fighting room by room. The Russians will fight in one room of a building, and if they lose, they back up one room and start fighting again and back up another room. They're hiding in the sewers and coming out behind the German lines. They're doing all sorts of booby traps, and it's really nasty fighting. I mean, it's some of the nastiest close. I mean, this is really close in fighting. Like the Germans and the Russians are shooting each other from 6 feet away and pulling out knives and going at each other's throats. It's literally hand-to-hand fighting, room by room across Stalingrad. And the Germans don't know why. They're like, why are you fighting this? The only thing they can think of is that Stalingrad is named after Stalin. It's a vanity thing. He doesn't want his city to be conquered, so they're going to fight for it. That's dumb, but we'll take it. Right? What they don't know is that the Russians have brought in 8 divisions, 4 north and 4 south. And in December, the Russians launch a massive pincer movement. If we put Stalingrad correctly right here, they do a massive pincer movement attacking north and south of Stalingrad. And the German army, which is 250,000 men, is right here in front of Stalingrad. The Russians are basically encircling it. And they picked this partly because the Germans had their best forces attacking Stalingrad. They had Romanian forces up here who were not very well trained. They had some other allied forces, Hungarians and stuff down here. The Russians just ran over them with no problem. And the Russian general, a guy named Paulus, radios back to Berlin and says, hey, they just launched 8 divisions at us. They're going to encircle us. I've got to back up. I've got to escape before the trap closes and retreat. And Hitler basically says, you're an Aryan and they're Slavs. You never retreat. Slavs never are defeated by Aryans. You've got to keep fighting. And Paulus is like, they're going to surround me. And Hitler's like, no, you are the master race. And Paulus is like, I really got to back up here. I got to retreat. And Hitler says, I'm promoting you to field marshal because no field marshal in German history has ever surrendered. Paulus is like, thanks.
So Hitler's just like, you are not surrendering.
Right. And to make a long story short, the German army very quickly is surrounded, and the Germans try and airlift to bring in supplies. It's not enough. The German soldiers are very quickly starving. It's freezing cold. It's January in Russia. And essentially, by February 1st, the Germans have to surrender. Paulus just surrenders his entire army. The Germans lose over 250,000 soldiers who are captured. Of those 250,000 who arrived at Stalingrad, only about 6,000 would ever make it back to Germany alive, because they either get killed at Stalingrad or they get sent to Russian gulags, and the Russians don't actually release them until the mid-50s. And so only about 6,000 are still alive to get back to Germany in like 1955. Yeah.
I thought that's a great instance of just like of Nazi racism like really, really screwing them over.
Oh, it bit them right in the
It's
ass.
like if they'd been fighting, if that had happened in like Britain per se, like they did try land stuff in Britain, like a land invasion of Britain, I think, but like if that happened, well, like in Norway, for example, like a place that they deem like Aryan.
Yeah, they would have retreated.
They
then.
would have acted completely differently.
Absolutely. Any questions about this? To make a long story very short, for the rest of World War II, the Russians now have a dozen new divisions, and they keep adding. And the Russians have a way bigger population than Germany. The Russians have a better industrial base than Germany now. The Germans are now, by 1943, getting bombed. German cities are getting bombed by American and British air crews, in the 8th Air Force in particular. And so Hamburg and Berlin and Dusseldorf are just getting bombed every night. And so German industrial capacity is going down for the rest of the war, and Russian industrial capacity is going up for the rest of the war. And the Germans really don't have a chance.
Do the Germans even like have any capabilities to bomb like Russian industrial cities? Like once they move them away from.
Yeah, no, they don't have anything that can fly that far because it's like 2,000 miles.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
so
Russia's
it's
just so big. It's like
yeah.
just hide it away back there.
And that's exactly what they did. And the Germans can't get there. They just have no way of getting there. Kind of.
That's like a half projection. Norway had curves, but that's gonna get curves. Like, is that still too far, even
Oh, you mean like getting to Leningrad or
though,
something?
or like, even on like a regular map, like, if Germany had some slightly farther airplanes, like even Norway, could they invade it to some of the industrial plants?
Well, I mean, they certainly were bombing Leningrad, which was under siege, but they didn't have, I mean, they could not get to Magnitogorsk or any of the other big cities. I mean, they're over here. They really are 2,000 miles from anything the Germans have. Any other questions about that? So essentially, the Russians would launch a major offensive in the summer of 43 at Kursk, which is sort of the middle of the line right about here, and they would begin to push the Germans back. And from the summer of 1943 until the end of the war in May of 45, the Russians are going to be basically advancing steadily across Eastern Europe, pushing the Germans back. They have more soldiers. They have a better trained army by this point because the Germans have suffered incredible losses, and they're replacing them with middle-aged men and teenage boys, etc., with very little training. And the Russians have as many peasants as they need, and they are giving them as much, good military training, and they have the luxury of training them for a long time behind the lines. But the Germans are throwing everything they have into the breach at the moment. So the Germans basically would have a long, slow loss here. Questions about that? So the Americans and British want to get in the game. You guys didn't tell me I said the year was 143.
It's crazy.
I was just keeping the joke to myself.
We've reset our calendar somewhere in there somehow. A new Christ figure was born.
I thought they were just time travel.
So the Germans have bailed out the Italians in North Africa, and I'm going to push the thing through. So Libya is an Italian colony. They're attacking Egypt. The British are there. In November of 1942, the United States is, the United States enters the war in December of 1941 when Pearl Harbor gets attacked, but the U.S. is not ready to fight. Just like World War I, it takes the U.S. about a year to really get ready to fight anybody. And so in November of 1942, the British and the Americans would launch an invasion that they would go through the Straits of Gibraltar and land in French Algeria. And they were counting on the fact that the French are going to be conflicted because technically the French government is allied with the Germans and Vichy France is allied with the Germans, but they know that lots and lots of French people hate the Germans and don't want to be on the side of the Germans, and so they're guessing that the French won't fight very hard in Algeria. And they're correct. Basically, the French are like, well, we have to fight. It would be dishonorable to surrender without a fight, but we really would rather have the Americans and British win, and so what we're going to do is we're going to fire our guns into the air and then run down and greet them with champagne so we can say, we fired our guns, we fought, but they overwhelmed us, here's some champagne. I'm making it frivolous and oversimplifying, but the French do not put up much of a fight. But the Americans and British now begin to push into Tunisia. The Germans turn around and come back this way, and the Germans and the Italians would really destroy the Americans. The first battle the Americans take part in World War II is the Battle of Kasserine Pass. And the Americans absolutely have no idea what they're doing, and they're fighting really hardened German soldiers, and the Germans win easily. But the Americans have lots and lots of soldiers and lots of equipment, and so they just keep plowing ahead. And over time, the Americans would get better and better at doing what they're doing. They learn how to fight, and the advantage the Germans had would evaporate. Long story short, over the course of 1943, the British would stop the Germans at the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt, and the Americans would fight this way and the British that way, and they would basically, by May of 1943, the Germans have surrendered in North Africa. The Americans and British have won. The Americans and British would then make one of the dumbest mistakes of the war. They're like, okay, we've taken back North Africa. We want to invade Europe. What's the easiest way to do it? And lots of the Americans are like, well, the easiest way to do it is you just go from England and you cross over to northern France and you just do an amphibious landing. It's just 22 miles across the English Channel. No problem, do that. But the British have another idea. Winston Churchill tells Franklin Delano Roosevelt that, in fact, the way to get to Europe is the soft underbelly, right? The attacking from France is like going at the bull where the horns are. You don't want to do that. You want to stab the bull in the stomach. So Italy is the soft underbelly of Europe. Now, the reason the British want this is that they basically want to make sure that there is no threat to the Suez Canal because that's their connection to their colony of India. And so they really want to conquer Italy because it helps them protect their colony. Italy is not the soft underbelly of Europe. Italy has mountains running all the way down it, the Apennines. And Italy turns out to be an absolute nightmare. They would invade Sicily in July of 1943, take that easily, and then they would invade southern Italy, and the Italians would collapse. Mussolini gets ousted from power, and the Germans would basically sweep down and invade Italy to stop the Americans. They would also take over the rest of France after the invasion of North Africa. So the Germans are now down here to fight the Americans. So from 1943, mid-1943 until the end of the war, the Americans and British are basically trying to slog up Italy through all the mountains against the Germans, and it's an absolute disaster. It's incredibly bloody, it's very slow, it's really difficult. So the Americans and British very quickly realized this is not the soft underbelly of Europe, this is the armored underbelly of Europe. And so in June, the Americans were like, let's go back to our plan.
That was predictable.
Let's go back to our plan. So on June 6th, 1944, they launched a major amphibious assault from England to Normandy, and that's the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. The Canadians would be involved, the British would be involved, the Americans would be involved, and each country had 2 beaches, and so there were 6 beaches. Omaha and Juneau and Sword and Gold and drawing blank on it. Any questions about that? At D-Day,
How present were the French towns still filled with like French people who were like, oh thank God the British are here and not the German?
yeah, I mean the French were. I mean the majority of the French population probably didn't like the Germans there anyway.
Yeah.
The Germans had occupied the north coast of France, and they had pushed out a lot of French people to create a secure military zone right along the coast there. But they had not gotten rid of all of the French population. And the invasion was actually a success, partly because, I should really end this soon, but the British and Americans did a massive, brilliant, masterful job of misdirection. Essentially, the Germans had correctly realized that there's two places you could really invade. One is the beaches of Normandy, where you can do an amphibious landing because there are beaches, right? The other is Calais, which is this. The English Channel is this narrowest between Dover, England, and Calais, France. And Calais is a major seaport. And so if you could take Calais, you could unload all your troops, et cetera, on docks. It's much easier than a beach. And the Germans weren't sure whether the attack would come at Calais or at Normandy. And so General Rommel, who was the German general, he had fortified all this territory, but he had a massive military force held back and reserved. It was halfway between Calais and Normandy, so that if the attack is at Normandy, he could send the reinforcements to Normandy. If the attack's at Calais, he could send it to Calais. Well, the Americans and British pulled a fast one. They brought in America's most famous general, George Patton, and they put him in Dover. And they set up a major military base at Dover. And then they built thousands of plywood tanks and fake airplanes. So when German reconnaissance flights flew over, they saw thousands of airplanes and tanks. And then they had Patton go and eat dinner in the restaurants in Dover every night. So German spies would say, Patton is in Dover. I saw him. He's here. And so that made it look like it was going to be at Calais. Then they took a dead body and they put him in a British military intelligence uniform, and they stuck battle plans for an American and British invasion at Calais into his breast pocket, and then they took a British submarine and they took it down to the coast of Portugal, and they threw it on the beach in Portugal, and the Portuguese found it and said, oh my gosh, this is a dead British intelligence officer, and look, here are battle plans for an attack at Calais, and it's going to happen, in early June. And so the Portuguese, being allies of the Germans, passed that along to Hitler.
This is a crazy plot.
It is.
Throw a dead body on the beach and hope they don't suspect anything.
Portugal being like, how did this dead body get here?
Yeah.
Just one.
Yeah. So, anyway, when the Normandy invasion happened, as I mentioned, D-Day, they attack at Normandy. And Rommel gets reports, the Americans are attacking at Normandy. So he's going to send his reinforcements to Normandy, but Hitler calls and says, no, that must be a feint, because I know the attack is coming at Calais. So they want you to send the reinforcements to Normandy, but they're really going to attack at Calais. So hold your reinforcements for a few hours. And he held them for 12 hours. And by the time he realized that, no, the actual attack is at Normandy and that is the real thing, it was too late. So the reinforcements did not get there before the Americans had taken the beaches and they had taken the bluffs and had gotten inland. Why?
I don't understand why a lot of the German generals were getting sick of him and tried to kill him at several points, because he was just kind of getting in the way.
And Rommel, the general here, was part of the plot to try to blow up Hitler with a bomb, which the Tom Cruise movie was about. And he would ultimately commit suicide because Hitler's like, I'm going to have you arrested and thrown in prison unless you commit suicide, so he did.
Rommel did?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, you heard it.
common trend.
So it seems like it would be more believable to throw a dead body on a beach after a storm or something, so that you could at least make a case for why it would be there. But if it's just a perfectly calm day and there's a body, it's like,
Well, I mean,
wow.
there was a lot of submarine warfare and naval warfare, so it's entirely possible somebody got swept off of a British ship or was in a British submarine that got hit and he got blown out of the submarine at some point, but everyone else died in the submarine, or, there's a lot of ways the body could wind up in a war zone.
No, this guy was on a speedboat.
Yeah. Any questions about that? Essentially, after D-Day, the writing is on the wall for the Germans. The Americans and British would essentially be pushing into Germany from the west. The Russians are pushing into Germany from the east. There would be a race to Berlin. The Russians would win it, getting there about May 1st. Hitler would commit suicide on May 8th. Hitler would commit suicide on May 1st. The Russians would get there last week in April, actually. Hitler commits suicide on May 1st, and the German government would officially surrender on May 8th. Any questions about the course of the war?